Welcome back for our next session in the Who is the Buddha series of webinars. And today's topic is the Buddha in Buddhist practice. So this is the fourth session in the series, and we're considering the Buddha as a feature of all the kinds of things that Buddhists do in the world and have done in the world for over 2,000 years. And of course, this takes into account the fact that the Buddha is not here, at least at face value. So we're asking what way he plays a role in the world nonetheless. And on the one hand, there's a sense that we might get from reading about Buddhism that the Buddha endures simply in the minds and the deeds of Buddhists as an ideal or an exemplary figure, the paragon of the compassionate teacher, or perhaps, as we discussed last time, as a social reformer. And this is certainly the case, especially for Buddhists in the modern world and especially for Buddhists in the West. But there are some more concrete ways in which the Buddha has continued to feature in Buddhist practice down the centuries, which are very prevalent still across Buddhist cultures and which don't receive quite so much attention in all the literature concerned with Buddhism and the figure of the Buddha. So today we're going to ask how the Buddha continues to be a focus of attention in Buddhist practice.
And we'll start with a difficult and ancient question. Where is the Buddha now? So you might remember from the second session in this series that in some early Buddhist literature, we find the Buddha seemingly dismiss some questions that his audience ask. And these are sometimes what are called the unanswered questions that pop up in Buddhist suttas or discourses. And these questions concern things like whether or not the cosmos has a beginning or will have an end, whether or not it has a spatial limit at all. These questions sometimes concern the precise nature of the relationship we have to our bodies. And they also sometimes feature, significant to us today, questions about the nature or location of the Buddha after his death. Where after his death does a Buddha go? This is a matter that the Buddha, we are told, refused to discuss because the literature tells us this matter and others like it are irrelevant from the perspective of Buddhist practice and the pursuit of nirvana. What can we say, though, about the Buddha's status now? Well, according to Theravada Buddhist tradition, in his final lifetime, Siddhartha Gautama had attained unsurpassed complete awakening. So he was Buddha or awakened. This entailed also his achievement of nirvana. And just to recap, this is an end to the production of karma, or the kinds of mental activities characterized by desire, aversion, delusion, and so on, that would then lead to further transmigration. So at his final bodily death, this would mean that the Buddha had no remaining karmic results then to experience. He is, so to speak, done with transmigration, and so would no longer appear in the world. Now, does this mean that the Buddha no longer exists? Well, Buddhism also denies that strongly. Nirvana is not non-existence or anything like oblivion. This is sometimes what Indian literature refers to as the idea of a liberation proper to a stone. In other words, it's unsentient and it's undesirable and arguably a meaningless idea of what it is to be liberated. So does that mean then that the Buddha must be someplace else? Well, this is also something that Buddhist literature denies. There is no other plane apart from the cosmos, complex as it is, that we inhabit and transmigrate through. Down the centuries and across different Buddhist traditions, this is then considered to be something of a mystery or something unfathomable to anyone who has not attained awakening. For Theravada Buddhists, the Buddha is not here, so plays no active role in the world anymore, but he's not elsewhere either. In forms of Mahayana Buddhism, the situation is more complex still. There's generally the sense that after the Buddha's death, and his death was something like a projection or a magical display, the Buddha still remains available to Buddhists and capable of intervening in the world, even though, again, he is, on one level, obviously not present in it. Given that the Buddha is not supposed to have clarified his status after his death, let's see what he is supposed to have said about the world after his departure. And we start with what we find in the Pali Canon. And once again, this is the authoritative Buddhist literature for the Theravada tradition. And the place to look specifically is what's called the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, or, rough translation, the discourse on the Buddha's final nirvana. The subject here is what's called the Parinibbana, or in Sanskrit Parinirvana, and this is loosely translated as final nirvana. The sense here is that the nirvana that one can experience in life might be the end of the production of new karma. But at one's death, there is then the last fruit of previous deeds that is then exhausted. So this would lead then to an end to any karmic results and a final enduring experience of a real lasting tranquility, what could be called parinirvana. Now, in the Pali narrative concerned with the Buddha's final days and teaching, the Buddha is held to have been 80 years old, and he had suffered ill health for some time. But he's made particularly ill by, and this is a matter about which some scholars have argued, it seems to be a pork dish that's offered to him by a devotee at the city of Kushinagara. So the Buddha is then clearly unwell, and he rests there, lying on his right side, and he delivers what would be some final teachings to an audience of disciples before he finally peacefully bows out from the world. The fact of the Buddha's death is often understood to convey some pretty central truths of Buddhist Dharma. All things are impermanent, and this includes even the lifetime of a fully awakened Buddha. And yet, because of what he has achieved, the Buddha does not truly suffer in this. He is ready and accepting of his fate, and he knows full well that with his death, he will no longer endure any further rebirth in the world. But understandably, the Buddha's followers are distraught by all this, as are a great many deities who we are told are in attendance. And they lament the Buddha's passing. So what does he have to say to his disciples and these deities on his deathbed? Well, famously, the Buddha says to Ananda, that is his faithful attendant, that his monks should be islands unto yourselves. This is now reading from the slide. Refuges unto yourselves, seeking no external refuge. With the Dharma as your island, the Dharma as your refuge, seeking no other refuge. What's important here is that the Buddha is meant to have left no heir to his authority, although it seems like the senior most monk, Mahakashyapa, did take on some responsibilities immediately after the Buddha's death. The message is that the members of the Sangha are their own refuge. They are their own support. They have received from the Buddha the Dharma, which remains true and superlatively valuable, whether or not there's a Buddha there to teach it. So they have then all that any sentient being needs to escape rebirth. A little later in the text, at now the very end of his life, the Buddha utters his final words. Behold, monks, I exhort you, all compounded things are subject to cessation. Strive with earnestness. And this sounds more technical than it is. Compounded things could be translated also as conditioned things. This is to say that these are all things that come about because of prior causes and conditions. And according to Buddhist thought, this is pretty much everything. So the Buddha's point is that all things we know will necessarily pass, even indeed the life of the Buddha. His monks, and then all monks after them, must endure to work further to alleviate themselves from transmigration. They must maintain knowledge of the Dharma in the world, and then keep to what the Buddha taught about good conduct and practice. Now, this stuff is fairly well known and celebrated by Buddhists of many cultures across both Asia and elsewhere. But there's other content of the Mahaparinibbana Sutta that I think receives comparatively less attention in Western circles. In the same text, a little later on, the Buddha explains to Ananda what should happen with the Buddha's physical body when he has finally died. And the Buddha compares himself to what is here translated as a universal monarch. Now, this is a category of ideal ruler that we find in Buddhist literature, a political figure. The Sanskrit term is chakravartin, a wheel turner. And this person would be a benevolent and exhaustive ruler of all regions. And the Buddha says, Ananda, as with the body of a universal monarch, so should it be done with the body of the Tathagata, that is the Buddha. And at a crossroads, also a stupa should be raised for the Tathagata. And whosoever shall bring to that place garlands or incense or sandal paste, or pay reverence, and whose mind becomes calm there, it will be to his well-being and happiness for a long time. And arguably, this is the more influential idea of the two that are currently on screen. Although the Buddha as teacher departs from the world, leaving his students to study and preserve what they've received, the Buddha as object of devotion remains very much present. We read in the Mahaparinibbana that when he died, the Buddha was ritually cremated, but then the remains of his body, or some of them at least, survived this process. And they were distributed to a number of wealthy and influential families across North India, who then revered the remains of the Buddha and his community. These families are meant to have done what we read here. They interned portions of the Buddha's remains at what are called stupas, or relic mounds, where the Buddha was then believed to still somehow reside in the world. Buddhist tradition holds that these relics were then gathered up again in the 3rd century BCE by the Emperor Ashoka, and then redistributed to 84,000 sites across India and further afield. Now let's take stock here. This idea of 84,000 portions of the Buddha's remains need not be taken as an exact figure. In Indian culture, this is one way of saying a great many. What matters is this idea that's early and then widely accepted, that there were a very, very great many portions of the Buddha's relics left circulating in the world. These were enduring and seemingly indestructible, even if the Buddha himself had surely died. And sure enough, Buddhists across Asia, that is South, Central, Southeast, and East Asia, have long believed themselves to live in the vicinity of the presence of the Buddha, at which they might make offerings. And as this text on screen says here, this would be to their well-being and happiness for a long time. So we could talk more about the Buddhist Stupa. This is a kind of monument that has peppered the Buddhist landscape of India and the rest of Asia ever since the Buddha is supposed to have died. A stupa is a relic mound, and some of these in the world today are noteworthy treasures of Buddhist architecture. And they are generally believed to house some remnant of the Buddha. Sometimes they're believed to hold a fragment of one of his possessions, so maybe a bit of his alms bowl or part of his robes. But often the belief is that they contain some maybe tiny but potent piece of the Buddha's physical person. So they contain a tooth or a strand of hair or a chip from one of his bones and so forth. On the right of the slide, you can see some examples of stupas from across the world, and this is just a glimpse. And the notes on the slide go into just a little more detail. And once again, you can download this after our presentation. Note in passing that the Chinese pagoda is based on the Indian stupa. The etymology of the term pagoda is contested, but one hypothesis is that it did mean a relic chamber. So this iconic design ultimately comes from the idea of a chamber for relics of the Buddha. We know from Buddhist literature of many kinds and periods that stupas have been foci for Buddhist practice for centuries. And also in this slide is just a little exchange from a Pali Buddhist text that comes not from India, but Sri Lanka, that concerns these relics. Now, Sri Lanka is a significant place, especially for Theravadan Buddhists. It's arguably where Theravada Buddhism, by that name, began. And it is to Sri Lanka that Southeast Asian Theravada Buddhists have often looked when their tradition required guidance. So the text from which these lines come is the Mahavamsa, or Great Chronicle of the island of Sri Lanka. And it was maybe finished in the 5th century of the Common Era. And it purports to record the history of Buddhism in its transmission to Sri Lanka and its fortunes there. And here we find a very senior monk and the king of the island discussing the arrival of relics of the Buddha from India. And they're being brought for enshrinement at a stupa in Sri Lanka. Now, the importance of this is obvious to the monk, but not so clear to the king. The monk laments, "Long is the time, Lord of men, since we have seen the Buddha. We lived a life without a master. There is nothing here for us to worship." And the king, like many of us, wonders what, if anything, is about to change. The Buddha has passed into Nibbana. But the monk replies that if we behold the relics, we behold the Buddha. And the point here is that the relics of the Buddha, that are generally but not always hidden from view, are not simply dead remnants, but they are still efficacious. They are the Buddha present in the world in some fashion. It gives the monks something to worship. And this is the important function of stupas and the relics that they're meant to contain across Buddhist Asia down to the present day. These things are objects of merit making. That is, the stupa allows for Buddhist devotees and monks to perform significant good deeds. In other words, they can do good karma. Because to make an offering to the stupa is to show reverence to the greatest, most worthy object or recipient of devotion that the world could know. In other words, a Buddha. And in a sense, then, the relics of the Buddha are the Buddha's continuing activity in the world. Some texts and traditions hold that it is a final and enduring expression of a Buddha's compassion. He leaves in the world his physical person, so humans and deities can continue to benefit from it being there as an object of devotion for generations after his death. And stories about the eventual disappearance of the Dharma from the world, which is meant to take place a long time after the Buddha's death, often also involve the disappearance of the Buddha's relics as a climactic end to this period in the cycle of cosmic history. And this before, in due course, another Buddha would arrive and this whole story begins again. Although less interesting to Buddhists in the West, this is seemingly integral to Buddhism across Asia, this idea of the relics, and arguably the cult of relics, this concern with the enduring and significant traces of the Buddha left in the world. And there's a rich history of storytelling about these relics, their travels, their being lost and rediscovered. And there's an interesting symmetry here between Buddhism and Christianity, as distant as these traditions otherwise are, because both for a very long time have invested a great deal of importance in the veneration of artifacts, and maybe even bodily remains in the case of Buddhism, that belong to a founding figure whose traces in the world are particularly powerful and valuable. I think it important thinking and talking about stupa worship and Buddhist focus on relics, because these are phenomena that until the modern age, we would have said were pervasive across Buddhist cultures. But as we might expect, forms of Western Buddhism haven't accommodated this aspect of Buddhism quite so much, irrespective of how important this is across Asia. But there are other ways in which the Buddha could be said to be present and available. And some of these also likely date back as far as interest in the Buddha's physical person after his death. So there's another stream of Buddhist thinking that sits in awkward tension to the importance of the Buddha's relics. And this because it downplays the physical person of the Buddha. It focuses instead on the Buddha encountered in his teachings, that is the Dharma, which unlike any physical form can be said to be enduring and which will certainly survive long after the Buddha has died. So this idea is represented in a short text of the Pali Canon called the Vakali Sutta. And this is a nice little text. And again, in the notes, you can find a translation to a good excerpt from the text that goes a little bit further than what we're presenting here. In this, the Buddha visits an aged monk called Vakali, who due to very ill health was incapable of traveling to see the Buddha. Monks who knew Vakali asked the Buddha to instead come to see the aged sick monk, the implication being that the monk is maybe not long for the world. And the Buddha does this, and he asks Vakali if he has any regrets, and he says that he does. The Buddha asks Vakali whether he regrets any flaw or lapse in his moral conduct, but Vakali doesn't. So the Buddha asks what the problem may be. And Vakali says, "For a long time, Lord, I have wanted to come and set eyes on the Blessed One," that is, the Buddha, "but I had not the strength in my body to come and see the Blessed One." So he's very much wished to see the Buddha in the flesh. And remember here that the Buddha is often described as having a magnificent physical body. He's tall, he's handsome, and he has this radiant hue to his skin, and all of these marks on his body that are signs of auspiciousness. The Buddha is a sight to behold. But in response to Vakali's comments, the Buddha says, "Enough, Vakali. What is there to see in this vile body? He who sees Dhamma, Vakali, sees me. He who sees me sees Dhamma. Truly seeing Dhamma, one sees me. Seeing me, one sees Dhamma." Now, there's a lot going on here. It's clear that the Buddha does not think that seeing the Buddha, the Blessed One, in the flesh is important in and of itself. But this because the Buddha is there to be seen wherever one beholds the Dharma, that is his teaching. Seeing the Dharma, we could say witnessing the Dharma, being taught and understanding it, one beholds what the Buddha really is about, or maybe what he really ontologically is. The Buddha is, after all, the mouthpiece for Dharma realized in the world. His function, from a Buddhist perspective, is to reintroduce the Dharma when it had been lost. He is the embodiment of Dharma walking around. His words and his deeds are ideal, and they exemplify the equanimous mind and compassionate activities that any good disciple of the Buddha should emulate. So the Buddha and Dharma are one. Now, there's no one definitive way to understand this passage. This is just one interpretation. But related to this is one idea of well, two related ideas that develop in Buddhist tradition, and especially in Mahayana Buddhism. And I'm providing at the bottom of this slide the two important terms. Centuries after the Buddha's death, Indian Buddhism becomes really interested in talk about the bodies of the Buddha. And this means not simply his physicality, but the ways in which he is embodied or present. And there's this dichotomy that emerges between the Buddha's physical person, in Sanskrit, his rupakaya, that is his walking, talking, living, and then dying being that might then reside at a stupa. But then on the other hand, the Buddha's dharmakaya. And this refers to the Buddha's being embodied in the Dharma, in a sense, his being the Dharma. And this is well represented in the lines of the Vakali Sutta that we see on the slide. To see the Dharma is to see the Buddha. So we could ask again what the status of the Buddha is in the world today. His physical person is not necessarily there for all to witness, allowing for the idea that it could be localized here or there at a stupa. But the Buddha embodied in the Dharma is present, wherever the Dharma is remembered or written down or taught. Now, there's much more that could be said about this idea of the Dharmakaya, because in a sense, this isn't just one idea. Different Buddhist traditions develop this notion in different ways. And later on, Naomi will mention just one other way in which Mahayana Buddhists have understand the Buddha in a particularly abstract or disembodied manner. But the takeaway point is that there is a sense across Buddhist cultures that the Buddha and his Dharma could be thought of as two sides of the same superlatively valuable coin. And a lot of these developments in Buddhology, that is understanding what a Buddha is, are proper to Mahayana Buddhism. And again, we can't go into too much depth now, but we could discuss this further at the end of the session. I want to give just one more example. Here's a passage from a very well-known text, a Mahayanist text, called the Vajrachedika Prajnaparamata, and this is often just called the Diamond Sutra. This is a text that reports to contain the word of the Buddha as remembered by Mahayana tradition. And it's been particularly influential in East Asia, but it's definitely from India. There's much here that goes beyond the content of things in the Pali Canon, but that could be said for basically all of Mahayana teaching. Here the text, the Diamond Sutra itself, presents itself as an object of reverence for worship. The Buddha is speaking here to one of his chief disciples, Subhuti, and he's just taught a great deal about how someone in pursuit of awakening should correctly understand the world. But the Buddha then remarks on the status of the thing he's just said on this very sutra. On whatever piece of ground one elucidates this discourse, that piece of ground will become worthy of worship, worthy of veneration, and reverential circumambulation for the whole world with its gods, human beings, and other deities. That piece of ground will become a shrine. In other words, the site of the delivery of this teaching, due to the power of the text, should be afforded the same respect as, presumably, a stupa, the physical body of a Buddha. Remember that a Buddhist discourse, that is a sutra, is one, if you like, concrete example of the Dharma. It's a report of the Buddha's teaching. And if we understand the Buddha to be embodied in the Dharma, then it makes sense that sutras be considered the Buddha's real presence in the world. One who hears the Dharma hears the Buddha. It's for this reason that, especially with respect to Mahayana Buddhism, Buddhist texts have been afforded tremendous importance, the texts themselves. Once these things began to be written down, we think either side of the year zero, Buddhist texts began to include the detail that whoever does this, whoever writes, reads, and copies a text, does this, does an incredibly meritorious action, an intrinsically good deed. And the picture in this slide is a cover of a text. This of the oldest complete printed text in the world. That is a copy of the Diamond Sutra that was printed in China in the mid-9th century. That's 600 years before the printing of the Gutenberg Bible in Europe. Especially East Asian Buddhists have for centuries reproduced by hand or using printing technology important texts like the Diamond Sutra, and more times than one might think necessary, but this because it constitutes a ritual act. The text is more than just a record of the Buddha teaching, but it is, in a sense, his continued presence in the world, embodied in Dharma. So where the text is spoken, or wherever it is simply preserved, the Dharma, and so also the Buddha, can be said to remain in the world.
So it should now be clear that shrines associated with the Buddha are a key part of Buddhist practice, whether as stupas enshrining his relics or places associated with events or with teachings. And indeed, as we mentioned in our very first session in this series, pilgrimage is an important practice associated with the Buddha and his life story, with significant events such as his renunciation, his awakening, and his first sermon mapping onto the landscape and creating a pilgrimage route that is still followed to this day. But you may be wondering how we've got so far through this session on the Buddha in Buddhist practice without mentioning Buddha images yet. After all, the Buddha is most visible in Buddhist practice in the form of physical representations of him. Buddha images are installed in every Buddhist home shrine, temple, meditation hall, not to mention in the West a fair number of garden centres, yoga halls and restaurants. So what is going on with Buddha images? A first point to note, perhaps, is that to many Buddhists, the perhaps flippant use of the Buddha's image as a decoration in the West is discomforting, if not downright offensive. And I find that this can make for quite an interesting little debate in the classroom, so I do include some additional information and a link in the notes to the PowerPoint file in case you want to follow up. But otherwise, I want to set that point aside and really concentrate on what the Buddha's image means for Buddhist practice. The history of Buddha images is not terribly clear, so we find various tales told that seem to show the Buddha sanctioning images of himself, but in fact there aren't any Buddha images in human form until several centuries after his death. The earliest images represent the Buddha through objects, so you may remember or have noticed on the slide around the Vakali Sutta, there was an image that depicted a wheel, the wheel of Dharma, and that was a way of visually representing the first sermon of the Buddha setting in motion the wheel of the Dharma. And worship of the Bodhi tree is another one that's quite common. That is to say, the tree under which the Buddha became awakened. Or indeed, the worship of stupas is also commonly depicted on the early stupa sites. So in fact, we find images of stupa worship rather than images of Buddha image worship, if you like. And here on this slide is another example. So the image on the right there shows an important scene from the life story of the Buddha. Now, he's said to have gone up to a heaven realm to teach his mother. So you might recall that his mother died shortly after his birth. And so it's a great act of filial piety and compassion to visit her so that she too might benefit from the Dharma. And this scene is his descent back down from heaven to earth on a miraculous ladder accompanied by two important deities, which is why there are three strands to the ladder here. And you can see all the people at the bottom waiting to greet his return. And if you look very closely at the top and the bottom rungs, you might be able to just about see a little footprint. And that is an indication of the Buddha. And indeed, footprints of the Buddha are still worshipped today, their soles marked with patterns that indicate his many qualities. So in this other photograph here, we can see the feet of a massive reclining Buddha image in Myanmar. Returning to the other image, we can also see a tree there. And again, this is another way to enshrine the Buddha, the tree representing the moment of awakening. And the railings you can see depicted around the tree show that the tree is a shrine, because we find similar railings around stupa sites, according to the remains that we have in stone. But while stupas, trees and wheels and footprints remain important objects of worship, the most commonly worshipped object in Buddhist traditions is certainly an image of the Buddha in human form. So whatever the possible reasons for not depicting him in this way in the earliest centuries, these were pretty quickly overcome. And nowadays, every day, millions of Buddhists perform Buddha puja, or worship of the Buddha, usually in front of a Buddha image. So what does it mean to say that Buddhists worship Buddha images? In practical terms, this often means having an image in a special place and offering it flowers, incense, perfumed water, food, even cups of tea, as you'll see if you follow the link in the PowerPoint notes to a little film about Buddha puja in a Sri Lankan home. Offerings are often accompanied by chanting of key passages of Dharma. Now, Buddhists are often keen to point out that worship of the Buddha is different to worship of a god. And indeed, in Theravada Buddhism in particular, as Chris has already mentioned, it is generally acknowledged that the Buddha, having entered parinirvana, is not available in the world to help anyone. So there is an obvious question there, which is, why would you worship an image of the Buddha if the Buddha can't do anything in response. And there are a few different answers to this, and it's worth pointing out that there's no one correct interpretation here. It's one of those areas where it can be quite dangerous to generalize. But I want to offer you a couple of different ways in which Buddhists explain their practice of Buddha puja. And the most important concept to keep in mind is karma, particularly the desire to make merit, this form of karmic currency, if you like, that will bring happiness in future lifetimes. Because paying honour to the Buddha is an expression of positive mental states. Faith in the Buddha, gratitude for what he's provided, commitment to the Buddhist path, respect, and these positive mental states will have positive karmic results. And that an offering is made with no expectation of the Buddha giving something in return is arguably a part of this whole idea, although of course your pupils will immediately ask how a deed done in expectation of karmic reward can possibly be a reflection of good intention, and I haven't got an easy answer to that, but be very happy to discuss it in the questions. And the role of the recipient is important in terms of how Buddhists view gift giving and other forms of devotional activity. So the Buddha is very often described as the most fertile field of merit. In other words, using this agricultural metaphor, plant your seed of karma, of action in this field, and you will get stronger and more powerful karmic fruits. And this happens without any intervention from the Buddha. It's just a part of the way that karma works as a universal law, given the status that has been achieved by the Buddha. There's also an idea that Buddha puja can be done for others through transferring merit. So although karma and merit are usually viewed as being linked to the individual doing the deed, there's also a long tradition of seeking to ritually transfer the merit of one's deeds to those less fortunate. So, for example, people might look to transfer the merit of their Buddha puja to deceased relatives. Or there's a very formulaic dedication of merit to all sentient beings that features frequently in Buddhist practice, and you'll even find it quite often in the front piece of published works on Buddhism. And again, if you're doing something to benefit others, then as a byproduct of that, you gain merit yourself as well. And I don't know if there are any gardeners in the audience today, but I like to think of this as the law of sweet peas. So that is to say, the more you give away, the more you end up with yourself. So a lot of explanations of Buddhist puja rest on this idea that it isn't actually anything to do with the response of the object of worship. It's not to say that the object of worship is irrelevant. It's the status of the Buddha as fully awakened teacher that makes Buddha puja work, but it works as a powerful karmic activity whether or not the Buddha is there. But it is worth noting that not all branches of Buddhism consider the Buddha to be completely inaccessible. Even in Theravada, as we've seen, there is a sense that the Buddha left behind some of his power in his relics, for example, or in his Dharma, and even in certain images. So, for example, some images, like the central one on this slide, the Mahamuni image in Myanmar, are treated almost as beings in their own right and are believed to perform miracles. And looking after these most sacred Buddha images is very much a full-time job. And while karmic understandings are helpful in thinking about Buddha puja, it's worth noting that the focus on positive mental states as determining good karma is also entirely compatible with the focus on positive mental states as aiding progress towards nirvana. So it's not one or the other. And indeed, many Buddhists consider Buddha puja to be a meditative practice. The mental states of faith and gratitude towards the Buddha, determination to follow the path made available by him, non-attachment to the items given to the image, all these are likely to result from acts of puja. Sometimes the very act of offering is considered a reminder of key teachings. For example, a Pali chant popular in Sri Lanka includes a verse stating on the one hand that flowers are offered in the hope of merit, but also that, just as the flowers will fade, so too will the body. In other words, offering flowers to a Buddha image becomes in itself a reminder of his key teaching that everything is impermanent. And the association of Buddha puja with the teachings of the Buddha is particularly visible when manuscripts and books are included in a shrine, as they are sometimes, or, as is common in Tibetan Buddhist traditions, photographs of living teachers. And there's an example of that in the right-hand image on the slide, which is the main shrine room of the Samyeling Monastery in Dumfriesshire, which, if there are Scottish teachers in the audience, you may well have taken your pupils to visit. And this entanglement, of course, goes back to what Chris was saying earlier about the close connection between encounters with the Buddha and encounters with the Dharma. So it is clear that Buddha puja is about a lot more than just making merit. And indeed, not only is puja sometimes considered a form of meditation, but practices we would classify as meditation are sometimes also focused on devotion to the Buddha. So consider this chant that is a popular focus of meditation in the Theravada world. It's here in the slide in Pali because that's the liturgical and scriptural language of Theravada Buddhism, but a Sanskrit version is also used in other parts of the Buddhist world. It's not something specific to Theravada tradition. And I've included a link in the PowerPoint file so that you can listen to a proper recorded chant of this done properly. But for today, you'll just have to deal with me reading it off the slide. So the chant is Iti piso bhagava arahang sama sambuddho vijja charana sampano sugato lukuvidu anutaro purasa dhammasarati satta devamanosanam buddho bhagavati. And it translates roughly as, like this indeed is the Blessed One, that is to say, the Buddha. He is a worthy one, an araham. Notice this is the same term that is used to describe his liberated disciples, so he's also worthy like they are. He's a Samma Sambuddho, he's perfectly and fully awakened. He's perfect in his knowledge and in his conduct. He's a Sugata, it's quite a difficult term to translate, a well-gone one, or a welfarer sometimes is the translation that people choose. He's a knower of the world. He's an unsurpassed tamer of those who need to be tamed, and a teacher of gods and humans. He's a Buddha, awakened one, a Bhagava, a blessed one. And the ti at the end is just like a closing quotation mark. So you can see here that this list of the Buddha's qualities emphasizes just what we might expect, that he is awakened, that he knows what he needs to know, he behaves appropriately, and he teaches others. And this practice of recollecting the Buddha's qualities, and I should say there are much longer lists than this as well, and also, for example, chants that list the qualities of the Buddha as represented in the special marks on his footprints or on the physical marks on his body. These sorts of recollections are really central to many meditation systems. When we find this particular recollection of qualities described as a practice in the earliest sutta texts, the recollection is said to destroy fear, to remove greed, hatred, and delusion, to cultivate joy and confidence in the teachings of the Buddha, and to clear the mind ready for further practice. It was quite a powerful activity. But once again, it's quite difficult to separate the Buddha out from his teachings. So not only is he very much described as somebody as a teacher, that's one of his key qualities, but the same texts that recommend the practice of bringing to mind the Buddha's qualities also recommend bringing to mind the qualities of the Dharma, and indeed the qualities of the Sangha, the Buddhist community that the Buddha founded, alongside other forms of mindfulness practices. And as an aside, of course, we need to keep in mind, if you'll pardon the pun, the fact that secular mindfulness practices in the West, although they are Buddhist in origin, are not representative of anything like the complexity of mindfulness practices in Buddhist traditions. And mindfulness itself is only one part of the overall system, or perhaps better, systems of meditation in the Buddhist world. And I just want to end this little section on meditation with a nod to this complexity. This is also going to help us to transition into the next session in this series, which is about the Buddha amongst Buddhas. Because, of course, the Buddha whose images and relics and Dharma we've been talking about today is understood to be just one in a series of Buddhas going backwards and forwards in time, or in some Buddhist traditions, available in different realms. And as such, Buddha worship can involve Buddhas other than Shakyamuni or Gautama. And indeed, next session we'll be talking about some important developments in Mahayana tradition that result in widespread worship of a category of Buddhas who reside in special realms called Pure Lands. And another Mahayana development sees Buddhas connected together into cosmic diagrams that we call mandalas. And mandala-based meditation practices often involve trying to gradually identify oneself with Buddhas or with Buddhahood. And yet another Mahayana development is here on this slide, Zen meditation, or Chan meditation as it is in China. Now, we don't have time to go into a huge amount of detail about Zen Buddhism, but I just want to note that the word Zen, or Chan, deriving from the Sanskrit dhyana, means something like meditation. And this is a branch of Mahayana Buddhism that sees practice of meditation as key to the realization of awakening. And so in this image, you can see some Zen practitioners sitting in Zazen, and this is actually a Swedish Zen center. And you can see that there's a Buddha shrine in the room, but the meditators are not focusing their practice on the Buddha. They may well perform Buddha puja as another part of their practice, but their formal meditation tends to be looking inwards. And one form of Zen meditation, as you may well know, involves puzzling over a koan, a riddle or enigma that helps to shake up the mind. You've probably come across some koans such as, what is the sound of one hand clapping? That's probably the most famous one. But on the slide here is another quite famous one, this time more directly relevant to our theme, the question of how the Buddha features in Buddhist practice. And it's attributed to a 9th century Chinese Zen, I'm saying Chinese Zen instead of Chan, but it's the same thing, called Linji, who is said to have told his monastic pupils, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. So, what does that mean? Well, first of all, don't worry if you're mystified by it, because that's kind of the point. As a koan, it's supposed to be puzzling, it's supposed to shake the mind out of its usual thought patterns, and only by meditating on it might you be able to appreciate its meaning. And for the same reason, don't be surprised to find lots of different interpretations of this online, for example, and in print. There's a link to one in the PowerPoint notes. And I don't pretend to know the answer myself, but I do want to think about 2 different ways of understanding the Buddha that help to make sense of this instruction. So the first of these is to think about Buddha as the quality of awakening, which all Zen Buddhists are seeking to realize in themselves. And the second of these is the Buddha as a notional external teacher. So according to this school of Buddhism, to the Zen tradition, meeting a, or indeed the Buddha on the road is wrong because the Buddha is within and practice is the teacher. So I don't want to go into the complexities here, but note that these different practices and ideas might seem quite complicated and unrelated, but that there is actually a common thread here, even when we reach this rather surprising instruction in our survey of Buddhist practice. So the Buddha is the focus of Buddhist practice because he is the Buddha. That is to say, because he has achieved liberation himself and because he has made teachings available to others. So as such, while some practices might seem just like simple merit making, there is actually a lot more going on than this. Buddha-focused practices produce positive changes in the practitioner, from simply generating an awareness of impermanence through wilting flowers on the shrine, or all the way to transforming the practitioner into a Buddha themselves.
So this is one session in which we certainly do struggle to do justice to the title. The Buddha features in Buddhist practice in a great many different ways. And so surely also in new and different ways since the development of Western forms of Buddhism as well. There's simply too much to explore here, especially just in one short session. But our central point is that although Buddhists still recite and study narratives about the Buddha's death, acknowledging that his time as teacher in the world was fleeting and has long passed, Buddhists also universally have some sense that he remains somehow influential in the world in one or more fashion. So this might be through the enduring nature and value of the Buddha's physical body, preserved at a stupa. Or perhaps it's because of the mysterious sense in which the Buddha and his teaching are one and the same. Or this could be because Buddhists continue to both remember and reproduce the image and so character of the Buddha. They do this in their minds, they do it in stone or in bronze or otherwise. And they understand this to be more than just representation. It's in fact the very real continuity of the Buddha and his real presence in the world. And Buddhist practice also involves, as Naomi said, other Buddhas of the past, of the future, and of the present, but in worlds other to our own. And this is something we'll discuss further in the next session. And then again, some Buddhist practice entails the Buddha as something still more abstract, the Buddha as the quality of awakening itself, something that's never far away at all, given the possibility of attaining something like the Buddha's understanding of the world, immanent and there for all of us, in all of us. In short, although the Buddha is obviously enough, not walking around among us, he remains very much at the center of all kinds of different things that Buddhists do in the world today.